My brother Danny died on a Tuesday in March. Heart failure. He was 41 years old. The doctors said it was a mercy, which is the thing doctors say when a person has lived the way Danny lived and finally stops. I was 6 years old when it happened to him, when whatever happened to him happened. I was too young to understand it then. I spent the next 35 years trying to understand it after. Danny was 12 in 1994. He was a normal boy before October of that year. I have photographs. I have memories. Thin ones. The kind you have when you're very small and the person you're remembering is more presence than detail. I remember him being loud. I remember him taking up space in a room the way older brothers do. I remember following him around the yard and him telling me to go inside. Normal things. Ordinary brother things. After October, he sat in chairs. That's the only way I know how to say it. He sat in chairs and he ate when someone put food in front of him, and he slept when someone put him to bed. And his eyes were open most of the time, and he never said a word. Not one word. Not once. For 29 years. The doctors use terms like severe psychological withdrawal and dissociative shutdown, and several other combinations of words that all meant the same thing, which was that they did not know. Physically, he was fine. Brain scans came back without clear answers. No damage they could point to. No explanation they could stand behind. He was just gone. The boy in the photographs was gone, and what was left sat in chairs and looked at nothing. I grew up in the same house as that. I grew up watching my mother spoon food into my brother's mouth and brush his teeth and dress him in the mornings. I grew up with the particular silence of a house where something terrible has already happened and just keeps happening every single day. You don't get used to it. You just get used to carrying it. At Danny's funeral, I met the other families for the first time since I was small. Kevin Marsh had died at 38. His mother was there, older now, a small, quiet woman who held my hand when I introduced myself and didn't let go for a long moment. Kevin had been the same as Danny, 38 years of chairs and silence. Thomas Burr had made it to 44. His sister told me at the reception afterward. She was about my age, the sister, and we sat in the corner of the church hall with bad coffee, and she talked about Thomas the way I talked about Danny. The appointments, the specialists, the hope that eventually runs out and becomes something else you don't have a word for. Thomas sitting in a chair by a window for years, looking out at nothing. 3 boys, 3 chairs, 3 lives that weren't lives, not really. Not after October 3rd, 1994. Standing at Danny's grave with the cold coming in off the hills, I decided I was done waiting for it to make sense on its own. Danny was dead. Kevin was dead. Thomas was dead. Whatever those 3 days in the forest took from them, it had taken everything in the end, and nobody had ever answered for it, or explained it, or even tried very hard to. I was going to try. Harwick, Washington sits in the northwest corner of the state, where the land goes thick with fir and the hills crowd in close on 3 sides. It used to have a mill. The mill closed in 2001, and the town went quiet the way those towns go quiet. People leaving gradually, the ones who stayed staying for reasons of their own. Under 400 people now. When I was a boy, it had been closer to 900. I drove up in April, 5 weeks after Danny's funeral. I had taken 2 weeks off work. I didn't know if 2 weeks would be enough. It wasn't. But that's where I started. The old-timers were hard to reach. Most of them had made a kind of peace with not talking about it, the way people in small towns make peace with local darkness by agreeing silently not to look directly at it. I knocked on doors. I sat in the one diner and talked to whoever would talk. I explained who I was and what I was looking for, and most people nodded and changed the subject. A few talked. The night of October 3rd, 1994 was ordinary up until it wasn't. The three boys had been out after school doing what boys in Harwick did, which was play at the edge of the logging road where the tree line started. They did it constantly. Every family in town knew their kids went to the tree line. It was the edge of the known world for children in that place, the way such places always are. You went to the edge and looked in and threw rocks, and then you went home for dinner. They didn't come home for dinner. By 8 o'clock that night, the search had started. By the next morning, there were 40 people moving through the trees. They went deep. They stayed organized. They covered the ground thoroughly, the way a logging community covers ground, because they know how to work together in those woods, and they know the terrain. Nothing. 3 days of nothing. Not a boot print. Not a piece of clothing caught on a branch. Not a sound. Just the forest, deep and dark and indifferent, giving nothing back. On the morning of the third day, a logging crew coming in before sunrise found all three boys sitting in the grass at the edge of the tree line, the exact spot they had last been seen, sitting cross-legged, upright, eyes open. The crew foreman in 1994 was a man named Gerald Pell. He was 79 years old when I found him in a care home 40 minutes outside Harwick. Small room. A window with a view of the parking lot. He was thin and his hands shook slightly, but his eyes were clear, and when I told him who I was and why I was there, he didn't look away. He remembered everything. He said he had remembered everything every day for 30 years, and he suspected he would go on remembering it for whatever time he had left. He told me what the reports hadn't said, what nobody had officially recorded. He said when they found the boys, all three were facing the same direction, not toward town, into the forest. Looking at the tree line they were sitting in front of, looking at the dark between the trees, looking at whatever was in there, or whatever they believed was in there. And none of them blinked. Gerald Pell said this carefully. He said he had watched them. He had stood there while someone radioed for help, and while another man ran back to the trucks, and while the slow machinery of emergency response got moving. And he had stood close to those three boys, and he had watched their eyes because something about those eyes bothered him in a way he couldn't name. And in the entire time it took for help to arrive, not one of the three boys blinked once. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen. Not the boys being there, not even the silence. The eyes. Open and still and fixed on the forest like they were watching something that hadn't finished yet. I thanked him, and I drove back to my motel, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The case file came back partial. Freedom of information requests in cases that old and that cold produce thin results. Redacted pages, missing attachments. The paper trail of something that was quietly set aside a long time ago and not disturbed since. What I got was enough. The boys had been examined by a physician within hours of being found. Physical condition, normal. No signs of cold exposure, which after 3 nights in October in northern Washington should have been impossible. No dehydration, no hunger, no injuries. Like they had spent 72 hours somewhere warm and dry and well fed, and had then been walked back to the tree line and set down. No shelter was found in those woods. The searches had gone in more than a mile in every direction. No structure, no cave system, no abandoned outbuilding, nothing. One page near the back of the file stopped me. A handwritten note, 1 page, attached to the examining physician's report. No signature. The handwriting was careful and small. It said, Subject 2, Thomas, had soil under fingernails inconsistent with local ground composition. Sample taken. Lab results. No match to any regional soil type on record. No match to any regional soil type on record. I read that sentence a number of times. The woman who had been a young deputy in Harwick in 1994 was named Ruth Ander, retired 11 years ago. She lived 40 minutes south of town, in a house at the end of a gravel road, and when I called her, she was quiet for a moment, and then said she'd been wondering if someone would come eventually. We sat at her kitchen table with coffee she didn't drink, and I asked her about the soil note. She said she had tried to follow up on it. She had gone to the county sheriff at the time with the note and with questions about what it meant and where the sample had gone and whether any further testing had been ordered. The sheriff had told her the boys were found safe and no crime had been established and the matter was closed. He said it clearly and he said it once, and she understood it was not a starting point for a conversation. She dropped it. She said she had been 26 years old and new, and she had a job she needed, and she dropped it. Then she told me the other thing, the thing that hadn't been in any file. She said in the weeks after the boys were returned, she had started hearing things from other families in Harwick. Parents coming in or calling, not quite reporting anything, not sure how to describe it. Their children waking up at night and going to the window, just standing there at the window, looking out toward the tree line. Not answering when spoken to, not asleep, just standing and looking. And then in the morning, remembering nothing. It went on for about a month, and then it stopped. And no other children disappeared. Ruth Ander leaned forward across the table and looked at me steadily. She said, "Whatever took those boys, I think it looked at the others too. I think it was choosing." She picked up her coffee cup and put it down again without drinking. "I think Danny and Kevin and Thomas were the ones it chose." I went to the tree line the following evening. I had photographs from the original case file, old and slightly blurred, but clear enough to identify a distinctive cluster of 3 birch trees at the forest edge that appeared in the background of the scene photographs. That cluster had been the landmark used to describe exactly where the boys were found. It took me 20 minutes of walking the edge of the logging road to find it. 3 birch trees close together, their white bark yellowed with age but distinctive. The light was going. I had my flashlight and my phone. I stood in the spot for a while. The forest behind the tree line was dark and dense and made no sound. No wind. No birds at that hour. Just the deep, indifferent quiet of old-growth timber at dusk. I was turning to leave when I looked down at the birch trunks and stepped closer. Low on the nearest tree. At the height a 12-year-old boy would reach if he were sitting on the ground in front of it, reaching back, putting his hand to the bark. Scratches. Deep ones. Cut into the white bark with something hard and narrow. Fingernails was my first thought. Made by fingers dragged across bark with real pressure, over and over in the same grooves until they went deep. 3 sets. Side by side on 3 separate trees, the same relative position on each one. The same marks 3 times over. The wood inside the scratches was white and clean, not weathered, not gray. White and fresh and new. These had not been here for 30 years. I took photographs, many of them, from multiple angles, with my flashlight and with the phone flash. I backed away from the tree line slowly and walked back to my car, and I drove directly to Gerald Pell's care home. He was still awake. They let me in because I'd been before, and he'd told the staff I was welcome. I sat beside his chair and I opened my phone and I showed him the photographs. He held the phone in his shaking hands and he looked at the photographs for a long time. His face stayed still. Whatever was moving behind it didn't come to the surface. Then he said they had made those same marks when he found them. All 3 boys, sitting in the grass at the tree line that October morning, scratching marks into the dirt in front of them. All three making the same marks, side by side, over and over. He and the other crew members had thought the boys were distressed. They had gently stopped them, taken their hands away from the dirt. He lowered the phone and looked at me. He said he had always wondered if they were trying to write something. I sent the photographs to 2 analysts. The first came back within a week. She said the marks were consistent with human fingernail scratches. She said the spacing and depth suggested a child-sized hand based on the reach and pressure pattern. She noted the marks had been made recently. The second analyst took longer. She specialized in pattern recognition and symbolic systems. Her response came as a short email. She said the 3 sets of marks were not random. She had overlaid them digitally and they were identical. The same pattern, made 3 times, on 3 separate trees, with a consistency that suggested deliberate repetition rather than distress scratching. She said the pattern did not match any known written language in her reference database. She said it might be symbolic. She said she would like to know more about where I had found them and in what context. I told her. I explained Harwick and the boys, and 1994, and what Gerald Pell had told me about the marks in the dirt. She did not respond after that. I went back to Harwick 2 weeks later. The scratches were gone. I stood in front of those 3 birch trees, and I looked at the bark where they had been. The wood was smooth, not worn smooth by weather, not faded. Smooth the way bark is smooth when something has carefully removed what was on it. Scraped clean. The marks were gone, and the trees looked like they had never had anything on them. I asked around town. Nobody admitted to knowing anything about it. Nobody had seen anyone near the tree line. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody looked surprised either. I think about Danny in that chair. 30 years in that chair, eyes open, looking at something none of the rest of us could see. I used to think he was looking at nothing. I don't think that anymore. I think about Kevin at 38 and Thomas at 44 and what it cost them to live those lives, if living is the word for what they did. What it took out of them day by day just to be there in the room, still tied to this side of things by whatever thread holds a person here, even when everything else is gone. And I think about those scratches, fresh ones, white wood, made within weeks of when I found them, 30 years after those 3 boys sat in the dirt at the tree line and made the same marks with their fingers while Gerald Pell and his crew watched and didn't understand. Danny is dead. Kevin is dead. Thomas is dead. So who went back to that tree and made those marks? And why do they match exactly what the boys were scratching in the dirt the morning they were found? I don't have an answer. I don't think there is one. Not one I want to find anyway, but I'll tell you what I know. I know Danny sat in that chair for 30 years and never said a single word to anyone. And I know that whatever was in that forest in 1994, whatever looked at those children through bedroom windows for a month and chose and chose and chose until it had what it wanted, it is not done. The marks were fresh. Someone made them recently, and then someone came back and erased them, and I don't know which of those things frightens me more.